Okay,
Hello,
I'm ready.
everyone. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anara Tabashaliva, along with co-host Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you're joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. And today's guest will be introduced by Professor Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anara. We are very honored to have back Dr. Yuri Yarim-Agaev from New Jersey, who will talk on how we can and must win this war. Dr. Yarim-Agaev has many credentials. He is the president of Transcom International, distinguished visiting fellow at Hoover Institution. He has been a senior research fellow at Stanford, at MIT, visiting scientist in the Department of Chemistry and New York University. He is a scientist, he is an economist, and he is also a human rights activist who was a key member of the Moscow Helsinki group and the leader of the human rights movement in Russia, working with Andrei Sakharov, Vladimir Bukovsky, Parvir Khairikian, and many others in the late 1980s to promote the peaceful dissolution of the Soviet Union and new independent states. Dr. Yarim-Agaev, microphone is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Victor. I start with where I ended because that is my perpetual topic, and which is the general context of this war. And I reiterated a little bit in few words what I said last time, and then continue from that. So my major point is that the war in Ukraine is not a local war, but it's rather part of a global ideological war. And I speak on this subject all the time, and recently I wrote the article, which I hope Victor distributed among you. Maybe you had chance to see it. In any case, I can tell you that I'm writing a lot and speaking a lot on this subject, and I invite you to my YouTube channel, Yuri Yarim-Agaev, and to my Twitter channel, also Yuri Yarim-Agaev, where I post all my articles and video presentation and developed that subject in details. Anyway, what I said in that article, that there is ideological war between totalitarianism and democratic world, which actually lasts more than a century already, because it started with the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917. And since then, the totalitarian works expanded dramatically, and many countries joined it. And altogether, those countries launched and continue without any interruption the ideological war against a democratic world. The war which is dictated by their totalitarian ideology. They are expansionists, they are missionaries, they believe that only their system is good, and free democratic societies and capitalism are bad. And they feel and that ideology demands from their rulers that they carry out that ideological war. The war is not, we pay attention to it temporarily. Often we forget about that. We know well about the piece of this war, which was called the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, which was actually a fragment of more broad ideological war. And this war is not so cold, as we know, because it manifests itself in some major war, like it was in with the Second World War, and it also manifests with many hot proxy wars, as it was in Korea, Vietnam, and now we have such proxy war in Ukraine. Actually, since my presentation on December of 2022, we now have two proxy wars. The second one is between Israel and Iran, and I call it Iran not only because the most recent events, but starting with Hamas aggression. It was war with Iran. Hamas is only was a tool of Iran. So we have now two such proxy wars going on, and that's important to understand because the context of this war influences everything, including Ukrainian support by America and by other NATO countries, with which we have serious problems now, as you know. And it's very important for ensure this support and expand it to remind and explain to everybody that we are not talking about local war between Russians and Ukrainians. We are talking about global war. And the Russian war is directed first and foremost against America, which they say explicitly. I mean, they fight it on Ukrainian territory and against Ukraine because they see it as a weaker link of the Democratic Alliance. They don't dare to attack America directly, but the ultimate target of this war is the United States. And it's very important to understand it's for everybody and for our politicians and those who resist any assistance to Ukraine, that they're not talking about defeat of Ukraine, but they're talking about defeat of the United States of America as well, unless they support Ukraine properly and let it win. Now, December of 2022 was a good time, and it was, I would say, high point for Ukraine in that war, because it was just soon after very successful Ukrainian counteroffensive of the fall of 2022, when Russian army was virtually running, and Ukraine succeeded to liberate many occupied territories. We also saw consolidation of Western support at that time by both America and European countries, which helped Ukraine with many new and very effective modern weapons. And we also witnessed at that time the weakening of the totalitarian alliance, which seemed very strong at the outset of the war, but which showed many signs of weakness while when initial Russian aggression failed. And China removed itself, at least visibly, while still being on the Russian side in the background. Belarus is not willing to join Russia directly in the war. Kazakhstan, which also didn't wasn't eager to take part in this war, and actually at some moments became critical of it. And Armenia more and more tries to move apart and show that sign still there. So at that moment, everything seemed to go well. Unfortunately, despite I say that there was significant support by the West, it was not sufficient, because had America and European countries in the fall of 2022 provided much more weapons and modern weapons, which would include long-range artillery, airplanes, and other stuff, Ukraine had real chance at that moment to defeat Russian army completely. But that didn't happen. And Russia was given a break. And since that time, the situation changed. And in many aspects, it changed for the worse. And I'll explain those changes on each aspect of this war. First of all, the battlefield, the front lines of this war. Well, the main problem was the summer counteroffensive of summer 2023 by Ukraine actually failed. It was a lot of expectations that after a successful counteroffensive of the fall of 2022, then the summer counteroffensive would go even better, but it's really failed. And it's failed for several reasons. The main reason was that Russia was given time to enforce their defense, to mining all lines of defense, and more important, mobilizing much more troops. In that period between the fall of 2022 and the start of summer offensive, counteroffensive of Ukraine in 2023, Russia mobilized about 300,000 additional people. And there were other reasons, which I'll get back later, but the fact is that this long expected and counteroffensive didn't work. And Russia, after that, went for offensive. If it was in retreat before, and it regrouped and went for offensive, and started to move and take over some Ukrainian territories, slowly, very slowly, with huge losses, but still moving ahead. It took Bakhmut, it took Marinka, it took Avdiivka, and it continues until now to move forward. So the main thing that it's regained initiative in that war. Well, Ukraine had many successes. Well, first of all, in elimination a great deal of Russian personnel and armament, tanks and other airplanes, etc. Also, Ukraine succeeded in moving into Russian territory and make some noticeable damage inside Russia, so that actually moving partially this war to Russian territory. But overall, if we consider what happened from the end of 2022 and until now on the battlefields, the situation changed to the worse. And when I say change for the worse, a change for the better, I definitely will talk always it from the Ukrainian perspective. So for Ukraine, a change for the worse. Now, in terms of personnel, I already mentioned that Russia lost a lot of people, but it mobilized a lot of people and continues its mobilization. it lost about 80% of its original army with which it started the war, but still it has much more people now than any other time. Well, Ukraine unfortunately also encountered heavy losses, and if we take it into smaller than Russian, but if we take it into proportion to Ukrainian army and Ukrainian population, I would say those losses are comparable, and the situation may be a greater burden now for Ukraine than for Russia. So in terms of armies and army personnel, I would say, and an amount of fighting troops, I would say the situation for Ukraine has changed for the worse also. And the same thing, unfortunately, I can say about the armament. Well, the main thing which makes situation worse for America is huge delay with providing military assistance by both Europe and the United States. And we are still waiting and hoping that America eventually would give new portion allotment of arms to Ukraine. Europe did it after also long struggle with Hungary and some other opponents, but it's too little and too late, and Ukraine found themselves in huge disadvantage because although a lot of Russian armament was destroyed by Ukraine, Russia dramatically increases productions of its weaponry inside the country to replenish those losses. It wouldn't able to do that on maybe in most important armaments. For example, it fails to establish production of tanks in some significant number or airplanes, but in more simple weaponry such as artillery shells, it produces plenty of them. And Russia, in terms of artillery shells, now has a huge advantage over Ukraine in proportion, on average, say 5-1. So again, in terms of armaments, the situation changed for the worse. Army's morale, which is, I always stress how important is that factor. And I, from the very beginning, I said that Ukraine has advantage over Russia in this sense because Ukrainian army knows what is it fighting for, and the Russian army actually doesn't. And I would say the situation remained about the same. Ukrainian army still holds high morale level and high will. Russian army doesn't have high morale, but it didn't break down. It didn't collapse. And that's not such a good news because that was one of the hope. So it's about the same situation with army morale. Now, countries and governments, what is the morale and situation is again about the same as it was there. Ukrainians are still holding strong and ready to endure all difficulties of the war and stand for their countries. Majorities of Ukrainians doesn't want to surrender. They want to continue to fight. Unfortunately, many Russians still continue to support this war. Again, one of the problem and maybe one of disappointment that this support, if decreases, then at least not very noticeably and not on the surface. In terms of support of governments and strength of governments, they are strong in both countries. Zelensky still has strong support, but unfortunately, it seems that Putin's support is also strong enough, and it's based pretty much on the support of this war. Now, one important point is intelligence operation. That was a stronger point of Russia from the very beginning. And when I mean intelligence, I mean both military intelligence, but I also mean all Russian operation of disinformation using the agents of influence, etc. And in terms of military intelligence, I would say Ukraine may have maybe even better, but in terms of such things as informational war and agents and influence, and also Russian agents inside Ukraine, which try to split and undermine Ukrainian government, and we saw signs of that. And that remains about the same, which is a sign that Ukraine and the West hasn't done enough in that direction. Now, information war, I would say, changed to the worse. Again, for the worse for Ukraine. Again, in December of 2022, we had the situation when everybody believed and supported Zelensky. Nobody believed and supported Putin. And I mean not Russia and Ukraine, I mean America and the rest of Western world. Now, unfortunately, during this time, Putin managed to improve its propaganda and information war in the West, and managed to get more supporters of this war, which directly influences the problem with military and economic support of Ukraine. So in that situation, it changed to the worse. Now, such very important factor as cohesiveness of democratic alliance and cohesiveness of totalitarian alliance. I would say that again, overall, it changed to the worse. I mentioned that totalitarian alliance is not so strong, but China behind the scene continues to support Russia. Kazakhstan and Armenia tries to move away, but the main problem is with the unity of the Western alliance. It seems that the Western alliance became much more shaky in its unity and support for Ukraine. I mean, in the United States, it shows first of all in the internal split between different political parties, and not only political parties, but actually many different political groups. So there is no internal unity in America in supporting Ukraine. In Europe, it shows in the lack of unity between members of European Union, and first of all with Hungary. Now, unfortunately, we get Slovakia, who elected the government, which is also against support of Ukraine. So the unity of democratic union is now in worse situations than it was before and at the end of 2022. And finally, as to economic situation in Ukraine and Russia, I would say it's about the same. Russia still managed to hold against sanctions and survive them, and even increase its military production. While Ukraine also manages to hold on despite the war, despite that significant part of it's occupied. That's all cities, and not only cities, are under constant bombardment and missile attacks. Ukraine miraculously manages to grow its grain and all other harvests, and actually not only feed itself, but export its food to other countries. And overall, definitely with significant part from the West, Ukraine economically holds on. It even started and expands the production of its own weaponry and in some areas, such as drones, very successfully. So I would say economic situation is about the same. So if we take overall situation in many aspects, it's changed in this time for the worse for Ukraine. And it actually feeds the ground of many critics of Ukraine and its support, who say that Ukraine has already lost its war, the situation is hopeless, there is absolutely no sense to provide it any assistance. So that is very the estimation of those changes and how crucial and important that are is really very consequential for further political decision. Now, to that, I would say two following things: that those changes, also bad and quite significant, are reversible. And that's a very important point. And I explain how they could be reversed, and the situation is not as hopeless as they see. And if we ourselves and America and Europe will not make it completely hopeless. And second thing which I need to mention, which is related to the reversibility and hopelessness of the situation, is that this is short-term picture which I drew. So those are changes about a year, a little bit more than a year, long changes. Now, there is also long-term perspective, which actually I believe doesn't look so good for Russia at all. For example, the last thing which I mentioned, economic situation and how Russia manages to, with the sanctions against it. But I mean, it's a temporary success, if it can be called success. I mean, the Russian economy actually is deteriorating, and this process would accelerate. So we would see the worse and worse economic situation in Russia and its ability to support and sustain that war, and if time is given for that. And the same thing can be said about many other things, including Russian weaponry. As I say, the destruction of many most important types of weapons like tanks and airplanes could not be replenished by Russia. So this will be going down and down. Now, definitely the problem with long term is also with Ukraine, how much Ukraine can hold, because it's losing a lot of its people. It's sustaining ongoing destruction of its cities, death of the civilians, and how long can Ukraine hold economically, how long Ukraine can hold militarily, and how long can Ukraine hold morally. It's still open question. At the moment, it seems that they can, but it very much depends on our help. And I'm still very positive that if necessary assistance and help would be provided to Ukraine, that it still has an upper end and it still can win this war. And that's why I say that we can and we should win this war. And when I say we, I mean not only Ukraine, I mean America and NATO, because, as I said many times, that defeat of Ukraine would mean also defeat of United States and defeat of all NATO alliance. And our victory would mean serious defeat not only of Putin, but also the whole totalitarian bloc, which is very important. Now, what should be done to reverse this process, to make sure and that we can win this war and to win it? Well, first of all, what can be done by America and Europe? The simple answer, the point number one, is provide all necessary weapons to give Ukraine advantage over Russia. Not only to put it at par, not only to level the situation, but I mean, it's shame to all of us that Ukraine, which has huge disadvantage in terms of number of people and personnel, which it cannot possibly increase in comparison with Russia, doesn't have more weapons and more modern weapons that Russia has, which can be done easily. I mean, it's the Russian might and the Russian technology is incomparably small with might, with the technology, with amount of weapons, with money, which Democratic Alliance has. And it's easily can give Ukraine absolute advantage in this sense. Definitely, all necessary economic assistance could and should be also provided to Ukraine. Now, we should stop trying to restrict Ukraine from attacking Russia on Russian territory. We're trying to do the same thing now with Israel. It's now typical approach by Biden administration, and not only by Biden, there are many supporters of this idea. It goes under very false premise of escalation, without even understanding how escalation works. And appeasement is the worst tool against escalation. Actually, the best way to avoid escalation is to overwhelm your enemy to show how strong you are. And we know it from everyday experience. I remember when I was a boy in Donetsk at the time. I was at high school there. I mean, there were some gangs all around the city, and you would walk. If you walk in the evening, somebody would approach you and say, "Give 10 kopecks," which is 10 Russian cents, which is actually was only pretense to start to beat you. So if you try to avoid escalation in American sense and Biden sense, you would give that 10 kopecks, and that would assure that you will be beaten heavily, because that guy didn't need 10 kopecks. He needed to start to beat you. If instead you would hit them strong, most probably he would turn away and leave. And that's how it works. It works in everyday level. It works in relation between countries. It works in war. So we should stop this thing with both Israel and Ukraine, tighten their hands and not giving them long-term artillery, not putting condition with giving them airplanes not to fly it over Russia, etc., etc. And that would be sufficient for Ukraine to succeed. Well, Ukraine also should make significant adjustments, which it can do, many of them even without our help. Well, the main thing which Ukraine should do is to modify and clarify its ideological and strategic position. Namely, Ukraine should make it very clear that this is not a war between Russians and Ukrainians, or even between Russia and Ukraine, but rather this is a war between democracy and totalitarianism, or freedom and tyranny. That's very important position on which Ukraine should stand. And that position itself would help to get more support from the West, because it's the same position which I explain all the time, that it's a general global war, that America is its participant, etc. If instead Ukrainians see that it's war on between only Russians and Ukrainians, to many Americans it becomes a local war which they don't want to be part of and don't care much about. And it would help very much Putin's propaganda and those who oppose any assistance to Ukraine. So that's one direct consequence of such a position. Now, that such position would also help to win information and psychological war against Russia, particularly inside the Russian army. Again, if you say the Russian soldiers, we Ukrainians fight against Russia, you all Russians are beasts, and we want to kill all of you. That's not very smart position in psychological war. However, if you say, look, guys, we are not fighting against Russia, we are fighting against tyranny, and this is tyranny both over you and over us. And you rather join us than fight against us. That's totally different position. Now, it's also important for the moral of society, for propaganda inside Russia, for propaganda in Russian territories, and it's also important for post-war development of Ukraine, which I may be jumping ahead, but if I still believe in successful end of this war and victory of Ukraine, and then there will be the issue how the new Ukrainian society will develop, on which pillars will it be built, on the pillars of political liberties and human rights, or on the pillars of fighting with Russian language and Russian monuments. Now, so that is the first point, which is, I believe, very critical to change and to clarify at least this whole context of this war. And that's what Ukraine can do instantly and without any help from other countries. Also, I write and speak all the time, and spoke many times on Ukrainian TV. Ukraine should launch a psychological and information war, first of all, inside Russian army. Use weakness of its morale. That's very critical thing. And unfortunately, Ukraine doesn't do much in this area at all. And also extends this information war on the occupied territory and inside Russia. Again, Ukraine can do it pretty much by itself, maybe with some help from us, but I think America would be glad to provide such help to Ukraine. Now, one thing which I also strongly advise and advise it to Ukraine is to make, and the same to Israel, to make alliance between Ukraine and Israel. It could be political alliance, it could be even military alliance, but those two countries should show their solidarity with each other. They have common enemies, Russia and Iran. And those enemies are united, and united against both countries. If Ukraine and Israel still don't understand it, that's very pity, but they should become close allies and help each other. And again, it would help to show the real context of both wars, that it was not wars of simply Russian against Ukraine or anti-Semites against Israel, and first those are proxy war of global ideological war, the main target of which for both Iran and Russia is America. Now, the Ukraine should do better trying to counter Russian intelligence. Russian intelligence is very dangerous within Ukraine, and which is trying all the time to undermine Ukrainian government and introduce splits within that government, and they should do better trying to expose it and purge it. But also, with the help of CIA, FBI, and other Western intelligence, try to expose some agents of influence in the West. And that's very important because those agents of influence help to propagate Putin's propaganda, and in many instances are quite successful, turning many people and many politicians against Ukraine and assistance to it. Now, if there will be success in exposing at least several of such agents, some of them may be quite prominent, it would very much undermine the whole Putin's propaganda and his operation against help to Ukraine. So that should be done, and Ukraine should put effort to that and persuade its allies, its other Western intelligence to help it with that. And the last thing which Ukraine should continue to do and should expand it, it's military operations in terms of its originality and unexpectancy. I mean, the main successes of Ukraine were based on how smart, original, and unexpected their operation were. I mean, the main example is that fall counteroffensive in 2022, which was successful mainly because Russia was completely unprepared to it and didn't expect it. And that's why Russian army virtually ran at that time. But among many, we have many other successful examples. For example, Ukrainian operation against Russian Black Sea Fleet, when it managed to sink its major ships, and with this water drones, which again Russia was not prepared to that. The same thing happened with Crimea Bridge. Also, Ukrainian attacks inside Russia on Russian airfields in Crimea and Russia itself, on Russian plants, on Russian refineries, were also successful because they were not expected. Each time it was something new, and that where is the Ukrainian force. If Ukraine abandons it and turns to very standard methods as Russia uses, which is Russia's weakness, it fails, as showed counteroffensive in summer of 2023, because it was predicted, it was expected, it was traditional, there was no originality in that, and Russia succeeded to stop it. So that's what Ukraine has, what Russia doesn't have. Originality, unexpected move, more initiative and more freedom to all levels of its army. That's what makes Ukrainian army strong in comparison to Russia, and it should build on that. while Russian army is too centralized, too stupid in many senses, and that's what makes it weak. So if all those adjustments are made, and there are no reason why not to make them, and first of all, if America and European countries finally realize that it is their war, that they should invest into them as much as they can, that they have a luxury of Ukrainian army taking the main burden of that war, and they should appreciate it fully. And their part is actually a smaller part and very achievable part to provide it with all necessary equipment and arms. If the West does that, if Ukrainians make some adjustments, which I mentioned, I believe this process can be reversed very soon, and that Ukraine can win this war, and we can win this war. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yarim-Agaev, for your brilliant and deep analysis. And I will open microphone if you can take a few questions.
Sure.
We definitely have several people here who usually ask very pointed questions. I just want to remind everyone for the record that we are recording it on 19th of April. Tomorrow, the historical vote in U.S. Congress will take place, and hopefully the long-awaited aid for Ukraine will be released after that. We really live in a very, very historical time at the cusp of events as they happen. In addition, of course, everyone is watching Middle East, and things fall together probably faster than we expected, as always happens. Please, questions or comments from the live audience, from our viewers and moderators, please.
Victor, I see only you now. Why? Should I expand? Wait a second. I'm sorry.
I don't know, but I see everyone. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. Okay, anyway, I can.
Yes,
Oh, yeah.
Katerina,
No, I see.
Yes.
You'd mentioned that Ukraine and Israel share common enemies. This is very fascinating. Thank you so much for your presentation. To kind of follow up on that, we've had friends suggest that the timing of the October 7 attack on Israel was somehow encouraged or affected by Russia, like to distract from what's happening in Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that? How, like, is that something worth considering? Is that a viable theory?
Oh, absolutely. I wrote about that. I call it Hungary Gambit, this whole thing. And we should remember why I call it that way, because we should remember 1956, Hungarian Revolution, anti-communist revolt in Budapest, which was brutally suppressed by then ambassador in Hungary, Yuri Andropov, who later became the head of the KGB and general secretary. And that actions by Andropov caused significant reaction by the West and in defense of Hungary and against the Soviet Union. But just it started, Moscow asked Egypt to block Suez Channel. And that at that moment, the war between Israel and British and French asked Israel to react to that. And at that war, at that moment, the famous war between Egypt and Israel started. And all attention of the world was immediately turned from Hungary to this war. And Andropov succeeded to completely drown in blood all Hungarian revolution with virtually no one noticing and paying attention what happened in Hungary. And when Egypt-Israel war ended, everything was already quiet in Hungary and nobody remembered. So it's extremely similar situation to that. And I'm sure that it's the same maneuver which Putin used with Iran because they are good friends, and the timing seems to indicate, I don't have any specific intelligent data on that, but similarity of those two events and logic of it and everything else shows that it was intentional and the time was not accidental.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your answer. I'm going to yield the microphone to Carol Smith, one of our friends of our program, and her hand was up earlier.
Hello.
Hi.
I'm a professor at Marshall. I am far away from your expertise. I teach mental health counseling. So it's a completely different discipline. I've been following and listening and learning about Ukraine for 2 years now. I have a very naive question. Was there a way to make the information that you just shared now about the war between totalitarianism and the rule of law, was there a way to have shared that information in a more overt and coordinated way at the beginning of this war when it felt like emotionally the Western support for the Ukrainian cause was so much easier to get? You know, we had this emotional reaction to, hey, this is a wrong thing that's happening. But I think we lost sense of our why is it a wrong thing? And what you've just spelled out is why it's a wrong thing. Is there a way that this information could have been shared earlier in a way that would have stopped some of the fragmentation of support, particularly in the US Congress?
Look, I'm writing and speaking on this subject all my life. So I wrote a lot, I spoke a lot before. Very few people listen to that, and I asked Victor to disseminate my last article. I don't know whether you had a chance to get it, but
I did read it. Yes,
so
I read it. Yeah.
And I write there about sleeping giant, during all this ideological war. So I'm one of few people who try to wake it up, but it's very few of us who try to do that, and while nothing happened, most Americans and Europeans prefer to forget about it, close their eyes, pretend that nothing happens. Well, which is actually deals a lot with your profession, it's because people don't like to be disturbed. They don't like to think about unpleasant things, and I was a nuisance who reminded all the time about those unpleasant things. And so a lot of things which happen actually deal directly with your profession, and all nuclear blackmail by Putin, all this trying to win this war by fear, to eliminate Western support by threats, all this whole false interpretation of escalation. It's all exactly parts of your profession, more than mine. So you can think about all these things in context of this war.
I just wish that people understood the larger context in a more thorough way earlier on. I don't think we would have experienced this lapse or lull in support. It's fascinating to me, and this is just a comment, forgive me. Michael Johnson, who is the head of the House of Representatives in the United States, has been dragging his feet on whether to allow a vote on support for Ukraine. And finally, he's come around. And I think he came around because of the conversation that he had directly with Volodymyr Zelensky. I don't know how that was arranged, but there was a conversation between those two gentlemen, evidently face to face. And then all of a sudden, Mr. Johnson's demeanor changed quite significantly. And now he says, well, we're going to have a vote because it's the right thing to do, even if it means risking my position as Speaker of the House, which takes a fair amount of courage. And I'm grateful he did that. I wished he had done it at the very beginning. It's just interesting to me how much impact a single conversation can have between the right people at the right time. I guess that was my comment.
Well, sometimes they do. I'm not sure about that. If it works, if Zelensky still can persuade some other people, it's good, because he significantly lost his influence during last year, unfortunately. So I think there could be another explanations that Johnson's meeting with Trump. It seems that Trump assured Johnson that he would stay in his position. Also, to my understanding, Trump was against the aid to Ukraine, but somehow, I don't know. We're talking about something. I wish such important things as American support of the war, which is its own war and which it shouldn't lose, wouldn't depend on such, I don't know, Byzantine strange situation and talks. It should be very straightforward. It should be mainstream American policy. And I mean, there are no real serious arguments against it. All arguments which I hear it's absolute nonsense, and they don't stand any critics. So, well, but also I can tell you the very fact that we have at least half a year delay in this help is very damaging for Ukraine. Very damaging.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you, Dr. Yarim-Agaev. More questions or comments, please, Anara.
Thank you very much. Your analysis of the nature and logic of the Russo-Ukrainian war is brilliant, And I have a couple questions. Why do Russians support Putin and his aggression? It's still unclear for me. I grew up in Soviet Union and I can't understand what is behind this. And the second question, why Russian opposition looks relatively weak and not well organized, and how Ukraine can cooperate with Ukraine as a free, actually as a leader of the free post-Soviet world. I like what you mentioned, and then how Ukraine can cooperate with Russian opposition at different levels. Thank you.
Well, it very much relates to what I said, that Ukraine should change or modify its overall position, that the war is between totalitarianism and democracy, or tyranny and freedom, rather than between Russians and Ukrainians or Russia and Ukraine. That is a critical point. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen. I would say Zelensky is ambivalent in this sense, not clear enough, but there are many people who are completely against this position in Ukraine and who occupy quite high position. So why? Because one thing which directly follows from that is that Russian opposition are the closest allies of Ukraine. Exactly. Because if you consider Russian opposition as, first of all, Russians and then opposition, and if you consider that this war is between Ukrainians and Russians, then they are virtually enemies of Ukraine. But if you are talking in terms of freedom and democracy and tyranny on the other hand, then you have the strongest allies. And unfortunately, it doesn't happen. And the worst example of that is the attitude of Ukraine to Navalny. And now, if I were Zelensky, I would award Navalny even posthumously with Hero of Ukraine, because he was the best ally for Ukraine in Russia. Yes, he said in 2014 he was supporting annexation of Crimea, but who cares? We should realize important things and less important things. The fact is that he was the main opposition to Putin, and Putin is the main Ukrainian enemy, and he was Ukrainian ally. And Ukraine was so stupid, it refused, Zelensky's wife refused to go to State of Union address because Yulia Navalny was also invited there. She didn't want to sit next to Yulia Navalny. Well, it's so stupid, it's so counterproductive, not to mention the fact that it was pretty much insult to American president, and Ukraine was hardly in the position to do such thing at that moment. And so that comes again and again to the same basic fundamental position of the Ukraine, how it realizes itself, how it interprets this war, what is its position. And if many efforts of Ukraine are now directed to, I don't know, to renaming streets and destroying Russian monuments or forbidding Bulgakov's books, I mean, come on. That what you should do during the war? Is that what? So that's very important question, to recognize Russian opposition as its closest allies and to provide as much support to it by Ukraine. That's absolutely critical point for Ukraine. And what is, you asked something
The first
else?
question was why most Russians still support Putin and aggression, and that's unbelievable.
First of all, we don't know what really happens and how many Russians really support it. It's very difficult to estimate it. And it's very vague concept, how deep is the support, how they really support, what do they want to do for that. The main thing which bothers me is not what people in Moscow say or in other cities. The main thing which bothers me is that Russian army still fights and sacrifices, and many people prefer to die than to become prisoners of war and to surrender to Ukraine. That is really significant. I don't know why this happens, frankly. And again, Ukrainians are bragging about that sometimes, that they are so afraid of us that they give example of Russian soldier who would blow himself in the trenches instead of surrender, of some helicopter pilot which was broken tail, didn't want to catapult and parachute and instead tried to get back to Russia. And I think that they should see that that's a problem. Nothing is good about that. Nothing is good about that. It would be good if that Russian pilot would immediately surrender to Ukraine and that guy in the trenches wouldn't blow himself but come to Ukrainians. I don't know, maybe Russian propaganda is very successful in saying that if they surrender to Ukraine, they all would be tortured and killed. I don't know exactly what's going on. But that most bothering thing, because that's deep. That's when people are paying with their life. What people chat in Moscow, in Petersburg and other places in support of Putin, I don't care. Tomorrow they can change their mind 180%, so yes, that's unfortunate situation. But I believe it can change in one day 180 degrees. I wouldn't be surprised at all. For majority of people, yesterday they will all supported the war. Tomorrow they would be all against the war. It very much depends how events develop. And if Russia starts to lose, all will turn around very soon.
Okay, thank you very much. And I already follow your tweet on your Twitter.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Anera. We have been for more than an hour. I want to thank Dr. Yarim-Agaev if he can field a couple of more questions. Definitely, while people are thinking, let me put one question of my own. What do you think is the perspective of next few weeks in turning the tide of the war? Will we have finally Congress approval of the proposals? How soon can aid be provided? What are new obstacles? And again, considering this is the election year, what can you foresee happening?
Well, I cannot predict quite unpredictable people because their decisions are not determined either by logic or by some solid political position. It's very opportunistic. It's driven by many influences. I hope. Well, as far as I understand, there still majority in the Congress is for support of Ukraine. The main problem was that it was never put on ballot. So I hope that if it is put on ballot, it will pass. Frankly speaking, when I looked in this package, I wasn't very happy about that, and because not so big part of it goes for direct military help to Ukraine. You know, it sounds like $60 billion, but if you look into it, it's only $11 billion, which is direct military assistance, which is a small portion of that. In terms of how, if it passes and signed, and how fast will it realize into direct aid and what Biden does? Well, here we have another problem, as you know, with this small group of Republicans. We have people who are completely against aid to Ukraine and who managed to delay it at least for half a year. With Biden, we have another problem. He does provide aid to Ukraine, but very slowly, very cautiously, and very restrictively. And I spoke about that in my presentation that, for example, one condition for giving them F-15, 16 airplanes was not to fly them over Russian territory. One thing, they still didn't want to give any long-range artillery to Ukraine. I hope they will change their position. I read that they are ready to give this long-term ACTAMAS, or what's abbreviation, I don't remember, of this weaponry to Ukraine. In terms of election year, I mean, it is in best Biden's interest to give Ukraine as much weapon and as soon as possible, to let them have some successes, because it actually works for Biden. You know, if Ukrainian successes help Biden, Ukrainians failures hurt Biden's chances for being reelected. And that's not accidentally. Trump was very unwilling to provide aid to Ukraine following his own interest in electing, because he didn't want Ukraine to succeed under Biden presidency. You know, that's was one of his consideration. So, I mean, we have, as I say, this, to me, the overall situation is incredibly stupid at best, you know, because none of that should have happened. You know, there is no reasonable and logical explanations for any delay, for such limited assistance, for all the things. So, because it's determined not by logic, which is my instrument, you know, and not by knowledge, but by some craziness, stupidity ideas, I'm not the best person to predict those things. You know, I mean, one of your professors who is specialist in this mental psychology, I think, should be much better than I answering those questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. More questions or comments, please? If we do not have any more, we will thank Dr. Yarim-Agaev for his presentation. Make sure that many people will see this recording, which will be soon. online. This was our 112th weekly meeting of Ukraine, a Marshall University group discussion panel on the war in Ukraine on April 19th. Please, Dr. Shrey, say a few words to our Ukrainian viewers.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям
Україні!
Heroim Slava.